Hello and welcome to the China Unraveled podcast, your unfiltered source for what's going on inside China and what it means for the world. I'm your host, Jason Scheftel, and I also used to believe the China story we've all been told. But after living, studying, and traveling throughout the country, I now know better. China's past, present, and future are not what they've been made out to be. And I've spent the last year turning what I've learned into a book. While on here, I shed some light on the big issues. In today's episode, we're going over China's coronavirus diplomacy. As the coronavirus spread, China started sending doctors and medical supplies all around the world. Why? What were China's real motivations? Was it an act of generosity and goodwill? And if not, did China succeed in achieving its hidden goals? The Chinese Communist Party has rewritten history many times. Now, before all of our eyes, it is trying to rewrite the present. So let's see how and why China is trying to gaslight the globe. Here's a quick recap on the story so far. In an earlier episode, we talked about how China spent much of December and January hiding mistakes, misleading the world, and permitting the global spread of COVID-19. In the last episode, we talked about how in February, China manufactured the appearance of a successful quarantine as a propaganda move to regain control over a deteriorating narrative. Then, by early March, China was ready to project the image of a contained virus and a powerful nation to the rest of the world. But the party still had a major problem. The virus was now everywhere, and China was the undisputed source of a global catastrophe. With every government eagerly pointing fingers to deflect blame from their own responses, there was no better and more natural candidate than China. It didn't take much to realize this was a public relations disaster, the worst public relations disaster in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. Since it was the cause of everyone else's problems, the negative slogans, ads, and attacks practically wrote themselves. China's leaders knew they needed to displace this blame as soon as possible. Runaway global animosity could undermine the regime's position at home. After all, if the rest of the world started scorning and protesting the Chinese government, then why shouldn't the Chinese people do the same? The party needed to change the narrative and morph China from the source of a global problem into the heart of the global solution. Or, if that didn't work, it at least needed some leverage to bully any insolent nations who tried to question it. To achieve this, China first tried to portray itself as the nation on the front lines of a global fight, striving to buy the rest of the world time. Then it turned around and tried to sell the rest of the world a best-in-class pandemic control toolset, before finally deciding to use its industrial might to position itself as the globe's medical factory for fighting the pandemic. This is what the news media started calling mask diplomacy, a catch-all term for when countries send crucial medical supplies to other countries in order to improve their international profile during a crisis. It actually started with other countries sending millions of units of donated medical equipment to China in January and February, but in early March, the party upped the ante and started providing motivated aid to the rest of the world. It decided to reopen the old Confucian floodgates of benevolence to gain greater influence on the outcome of an ensuing crisis. Of course, its motivations were far from benevolent. One of the confused terms Xi Jinping came up with for this campaign was the quote, "Health Silk Road." Yes, another tired, almost unbearable homage to the old Silk Road, and also a dead giveaway for another unholy mixture of Chinese diplomacy, policy, and propaganda. Early March was well timed because as China appeared to be getting the virus under control, its newly nationalized medical supply industry was ramping up production. Before March, China was actually hoarding medical supplies. According to a Bloomberg report, it scoured the world for bulk medical purchases and recruited international Chinese companies to secure and ship medical equipment back to the mainland. In just one day at the end of January, it imported 20 million respirators and surgical masks. Early March is also when the virus began to blow up in Europe and especially in Italy. Italy became the first beneficiary of China's mask diplomacy. But here's an important question. Why did China choose to help Italy? Yes, Italy was the hardest hit European state, but Italy was not chosen because it was suffering the most. It was chosen because it was a good political opportunity. One of Italy's governing parties is very pro-China, and Italy was the first European country to join Beijing's harebrained Belt and Road Initiative. Italy is the largest of many Eurosceptic nations, from Hungary to Serbia, who all want to use China to help them with their many, many problems with the EU. From China's perspective, these countries are useful patsies on its march to greater global power and influence. It gets to insert itself into Europe, gaining good press and international attention, while also further dividing the continent. Not that anyone needs to actively divide Europe, because it will do that all by itself, but China still decided to use its growing affiliate media relationships and the globe's desire for decisive action to trumpet its shipments to Italy. When China's first shipment of medical supplies landed on March 12th, the phrase, "The Friendship Road knows no borders," could be seen written on the packaging of unloaded supplies. Since then, airlifted medical supplies from China have been seen all over the world. As of late April, China claims to have given over 2 million masks to Italy. This sounds like a big number, but it is mostly a loud number. France and Germany have given more to Italy, they just aren't as eager for the spotlight. And here's the crucial thing. They actually gave the supplies to Italy. China isn't primarily giving medical supplies to other countries, it is selling them. China has sold millions of units of supplies to Italy and across the rest of the world, even selling back some equipment that other countries originally donated to China. Chinese donations are coming from wealthy Chinese companies and individuals who are using this as an opportunity to enhance their image as well as protect and expand their business relationships. And you can't really blame them either. If I were Huawei, I'd also try to donate 1 million masks and get some goodwill. But naturally, these companies are also being used by the party to foot the bill for repairing some of China's battered reputation. Otherwise, China is basically doing what it has been doing for the last 45 years, selling as much of whatever the global market wants as it possibly can. The game is unchanged. During the pandemic, it has just been given a moralizing spin. Now, the core idea behind sending aid is solid. If China had really just supplied needy countries with as much medical supplies as it could provide, then it might have racked up some great PR, maybe enough to send shivers of ecstasy through the Central Committee's propaganda department. China could have looked remorseful and accountable, as if it were finally using some of its strengths to repair the damage caused by its weaknesses. This is not what happened. To the party, mask diplomacy was not a way to accept responsibility. It was a way to deflect blame and create opportunities. Remember that inside China, all information is controlled by the party. The party line rules the airwaves. This is the world the party is most familiar with and most comfortable in. When the party acts on the international stage, it maintains the same desire and expectation for information control, regardless of whether this control is practical or realistic. Not only is the outside world the opposite of the airtight mainland, but crisis-struck China has too many political objectives working at cross purposes for it to present any coherent and respectable image to the rest of the world. It was destined to shoot itself in the foot multiple times during this crisis. Listen to China's foreign ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian explaining why China supplies other countries. Quote, "To act on international humanitarianism and to implement the vision of a community with a shared future for mankind." End quote. China is trying to spin its global sales campaign as if it were an act of generosity and shared spirit. Well, that might be more believable if the guy who said this wasn't also the same guy who said it was the US Army that originally brought COVID-19 to Wuhan. What a surprise nobody believes him when he starts talking about a shared global community. Let's cut to the chase. China will try and sound generous, but it just can't act generous. China is selectively giving aid to certain useful countries, denying or ignoring less impactful ones, threatening to reduce shipments, all while demanding praise and acknowledgement for its actions. Every action is first filtered through China's domestic politics and its global political ambitions, and then contorted back into useful domestic propaganda at home. Generosity is not something that pops out of this sort of decision-making process. Balancing goodwill and calculated political action is not the party's strong suit. What it is much better equipped for is to just double down on a global information war. Remember, Beijing did not come into this crisis looking good. At home, it had covered up the outbreak and suppressed information. Abroad, it was the source of the pandemic. There was no way out of this one, but the party still had to try. It had to at least work to stem the blood flow. Turning supply shipments into a publicity blitz was supposed to be the positive side to this whole operation. Instead, a lot of China's medical equipment started to fail right away and in the media spotlight. 80% of the masks sent to the Czech Republic failed. 1 million respirators sent to Canada were defective. Over 1 million testing kits sent to Slovakia had to be tossed. Millions of tests and pieces of personal protective equipment had to be recalled, returned, or discarded. It would take too long to list them all, but various supplies sent to the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, the Philippines, Georgia, Turkey, and many other countries all failed. And this is also probably just the tip of the iceberg, since many countries don't want to mention what went wrong and draw China's ire. China is not intentionally shipping faulty equipment. Bringing back bad memories of the late 1990s and early 2000s version of the Made in China brand is the last thing the party wants as it tries to upbrand itself with its Made in China 2025 program. All of these failures were instead the result of poor quality control as production volumes expanded and quality plummeted. Every single factory that could get in on the action tried to, whether or not it had the skills or materials. Even after China started to correct these problems, these equipment failures were devastating to the heroic global image Beijing wanted to create. When our good friend Zhao Lijian steps in again to say, quote, "If someone complains that China's exports are toxic, then stop wearing China-made masks and protective gowns," end quote. Well, countries are not imagining his threatening and dismissive tone. But even if all the equipment worked, all the diplomats were diplomatic, and the publicity was amazing, the long-term effects of even the best and most benevolent mass diplomacy would not have been as good as the regime may have imagined. Yes, people may be grateful for these needed supplies, but gratitude is rare and fleeting. Soon, countries are reminded of their dependence and helplessness. The US and Europe both import about 50% of personal protective equipment from China. And before the crisis, China made over 40% of the world's imported masks, gloves, goggles, visors, and medical garments. This disparity is not a pleasant one from the importing side. China also provoked corporate anger when it forced foreign firms to produce medical equipment for China's domestic use. International dependence and a lack of control over medical supply chains has produced huge public concern and demands for change. To make it worse, the crisis is also stimulating policy action and business innovation to do just that. So China was trying to create an image where it was the arsenal of medicine. Even though its equipment was failing, international dependence was creating resentment, clandestine medical shipments were being sent back to the mainland, and its government nationalized a key global industry during an international crisis. And again, mass diplomacy was supposed to be the charm offensive. This was the good stuff. The other stuff China has been up to is much more devious. People are aware of the medical supplies China sent to Italy and later around the world, but not what else it has been sending: coordinated disinformation. At the same time China was sending personal protective equipment to Italy, it was also waging a massive disinformation campaign to try and confuse Italians and people around the globe about where the virus came from. The state-controlled Global Times wrote on Twitter that, quote, "Italy may have had an unexplained strain of pneumonia as early as November and December 2019, with highly suspected symptoms of COVID-19, reports said." Yes, it is actually trying to say that the virus did not start in China. China also later spun an Italian medical researcher's comments to make him sound like he was saying the same thing. And it gets even weirder. China's central television broadcast these conspiracy theories, and they were turned into a trending topic on Chinese microblogs. The party was still half trying to deceive its own people about the origins of the virus. And it later doubled down on this by heavily reporting new outbreaks as resulting from foreign travel. If this sounds contradictory, twisted, and confused, it's because it is. But that doesn't stop China from layering even more propaganda down on top. Listen to this one again from the Global Times. Quote, "Different voices among Chinese diplomats mirror China's diversified discourse system and a democratic decision-making system," end quote. Yes, China is actually trying to present its jumbled descriptions of what is going on as if they are representative of free debate rather than a reactionary and scared regime. And that's just the start. If China is merely a warm-hearted global citizen, why did one of its diplomats send the Wisconsin State Senate a draft law meant to praise China's, quote, transparency and unprecedented and rigorous measures in ending the outbreak? Why were intelligence officers sending text messages to U.S. citizens inflaming fears about looting and rioting during a coming U.S. lockdown? Why did Chinese officials try to get German officials to publicly declare China a, quote, reliable partner and prudent crisis manager, end quote? These are not the actions of a good Samaritan. As Elizabeth Economy, the director of Asian Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, says, quote, it seems strange to expect signed declarations of thanks from other countries in the midst of the crisis. This is certainly not in the tradition of the best humanitarian relief efforts, end quote. So why is all this happening? It's happening because China is trying to square internal and external narratives while also trying to take advantage of the situation at the same time. To put it simply, China's thoughts, words, and actions are way out of alignment. It wants to seem reliable and trustworthy while also benefiting from the current chaos. It wants to make up for its mistakes without admitting any mistakes. It wants to aggressively defend China on the world stage without acknowledging any weaknesses at home. China needs to spin multiple stories at once, and it is getting caught in a knot, and China knows it. A vice foreign minister recently said, quote, we must put forth a true, three-dimensional, and comprehensive picture of China to international society, end quote, more or less admitting China's foreign policy is hopelessly mangled. It is pretty hard to present a true picture of China to the world with propaganda spewing and frothing in every direction, and China's wolf warrior diplomats running around like a bunch of chickens with their heads cut off. It also makes it impossible for China to ever have a true picture of itself. During a major public crisis, China always struggles to balance its political needs with the rest of the world's need for accurate information and timely action. It never manages to do both at once. The longer the crisis goes on, the more secure and impenetrable the propaganda bubble becomes, the more it is internalized by the population, and the more ingrained the regime becomes in its position. Across domestic state media, China is now gloating about its pandemic response. It loves how its decisive response compares to the patchwork U.S. response and is looking to highlight these differences to discredit U.S. leadership. The tone has strong echoes of the 2008 financial crisis, when China sounded very triumphalist notes about an international changing of the guard. China obviously sees the pandemic as an opportunity and hopes its coronavirus diplomacy will mesh with its other international projects to let it better challenge the US. With a head full of propaganda steam, the party is still imagining a world that is disintegrating before its very eyes. When the dust settles on this pandemic, China is not looking at a friendlier world. It is looking at a more chaotic and less global world. If China thinks it can cause a global pandemic and then be seen as the global savior, it is in for a rude awakening. That's like stabbing someone and then handing them some rags to dress the wounds. It's not going to win you any long-term friends, and you should probably keep your eyes open.